Hey there, nerds. A little drive time chat with Jimmy. We're talking about George Miller, the iconic director. He recently sat down with Robert Rodriguez for his director series on the El Rey Network and discussed his film career. Now, let me start with Robert Rodriguez. I'm not the biggest fan of Robert. I enjoy his movies. He's not like I feel like George Lucas is my favorite movie icon because he created this franchise and he's directed several films. I know directing's not his strong suit or writing, but what he's produced is amazing. I look at Robert Rodriguez in a similar way in that he made films his way, and if the technology wasn't there, he created a way to do that. And that is amazing to me. One of the other amazing things I love is that he went to go make Sin City and he wanted to include Frank Miller as a director. And the DGA said, no, can't have that, can't do that. So Robert Rodriguez goes, okay, boom, I'm out of the DGA, done. A very similar move to what George Lucas did once upon a time, where he said, oh, I can't have my production company Lucasfilm in front of my film because it's announcing basically a director before the actual director. Fine, boom, I'm out of the DGA. To take that power and wield it in a way that makes sense, because the decisions the DGA made in both those cases was ridiculous, is just so powerful to me. And the fact that Robert Rodriguez did it is very awesome. And on a personal level, his Spy Kid movies are great. My children love them. They have now found him. I know they're older than my children, so they've gone back and found him. But one of his more recent ones, the son has hearing aids. My daughter has hearing aids. Not a lot of films show disability in that way, in a heroic way. My daughter has latched on to that character and loves that character. Loves what he's able to do, his accomplishments, that he's a Spy Kid. My daughter now plays Spy Kids all the time. And for that, I am very grateful for Robert Rodriguez to realize and understand that there are kids with disabilities, and it's not necessarily a disability that holds them back. And to show that on screen shows my daughter that she's able to accomplish anything she wants. And I love that. I love that for him. But getting away from the fact that George Miller was the focus of this piece. I've always been a fan of George Miller. I found him with Beyond the Thunderdome. I would be at Heritage School, and we had one of those playgrounds that had a little dome thing where you would climb on. And I had no idea what kids were talking about, but two kids would go in and fake fight, and it would be 2-man enter, 1-man leave. What is this great concept? I have no idea. We just hung around the little dome thing yelling, yay, 2-man enter, 1-man leave, and I didn't know what that meant. So I was introduced to Beyond the Thunderdome. That was my introduction to George Miller. Now, a lot of people pan that film. I actually thoroughly enjoy it, being that was my introduction into this post-apocalyptic world of Max. It was fantastic. I loved it. I wanted to know more. And maybe that's where I was lucky, because that was my introduction, and I hold that film to a little higher standard than most people do, or love that film a little better than most people do. Then I went back and started at the beginning, and I saw Mad Max. At the time, as a kid, I didn't appreciate Mad Max as much because Beyond the Thunderdome was better put together, more produced, whereas Mad Max is just raw and brutal. But now, as an older filmmaker, I thoroughly enjoy what he was able to put together and how he was able to put together. And that's what he talked about in this interview, is how he put these pieces together, and how growing up in the outback of Australia, he and his brothers, who didn't have TV or didn't get films, would get magazines. And I still can't understand this, and I can't remember if he explained this or not. They would get like movie making and cinematography magazines, and they would break it down. And they would fell in love with directors like Alfred Hitchcock, yet they never saw his films yet. And I find that fascinating, that you can learn filmmaking without ever having seen or touched film. That blows my mind. I also didn't know that George Miller was a doctor. That was his training as a doctor, which sort of makes sense with some of the horrific scenes that he is able to portray on film. You're like, wow, did he see something like that in real life? That's crazy. But telling the story of how he got to make Mad Max and the camp he went to learn how to filmmake, or seminar he went to learn how to filmmake. In fact, he wasn't even the one that was supposed to go. It was his brother, and he talked his way into it. And he makes Mad Max, and he follows that up with the road warrior and the intricate detail he learns to pay attention to filmmaking, and that he learns by making the films, and that he learns how to do the stunts, and that he studies, hey, I'm going to look at every single stunt accident that has happened in film and find out what the common denominator is and try to prevent that. That's amazing, because his films are huge when it comes to stunts and real action. So to take that precaution and go to visit the set earlier than anybody else and make sure that everything is perfect place, just a phenomenal director. And then telling stories of like going on to the Twilight Zone. And obviously in Australia, back in the 80s, he's using his own equipment and production crew and just people he can find around. And one of his biggest friends and influences was Byron Kennedy, and he talks about that, how Byron knew and understood a lot of this stuff, and it was really George who was learning from Byron, and Byron coming up with these ideas like, hey, we're going to shoot Mad Max in a wide shot, but in order to make it interesting, so it's not a car going across frame for 5 minutes, because that's how long it takes to get across frame, we're going to shoot up close on the car and from its low angle, so we can get this, portray this action and this sense of danger. And that he's learning on set, so that now he gets to the Twilight Zone, and as he said, he essentially inherited the crew that did Steven Spielberg's E.T. And it's like, oh my God, that is phenomenal. So again, he's learning. And as he's going by, and I don't remember the name of the segment, but he did the one with John Lithgow on the airplane. And they're going along, and then whispers are like, well, this might be the conclusion to the film, like this might be the last segment, it's that good. And he's like, I'm just making a film, that's what I'm doing. I'm using what I learned from the cinematography magazines with Alfred Hitchcock, which he's now seen the movies, and trying to put that into a film, and it worked beautifully. That is one of the best segments. Then he goes on to talk about other movies he directed that I'm not as familiar with, such as The Witches of Eastwick. That sounds phenomenal, working with Jack Nicklaus, and how working with him was again a little course in how to filmmake, and that Jack really stood by his vision. And as the studio came in to question George and what he was doing, Jack said, hey, you're paying me a lot of money, and I'm going to walk if you're not going to do what he wants. And it's like, man, that is amazing to hear. And throughout this whole interview process, George is saying things to Robert Rodriguez like, well, you know, like this is how you do it. Well, you figured it out. And Robert sits there and goes, no, George, no, I have never done that. I wouldn't know how to figure it out. You are truly a unique figure. And that just shows how humble this man is, that he's created such amazing things. And truly, if there was no way to do it, George Miller would find a way to film it. Unbelievable. And that goes to one of his other films, Babe. He was making Babe. He did not direct this one. As he says, he was directing Lorenzo's Oil, which is another great film that I haven't seen in a very long time, so I have to go back and rewatch it. But it talks about a disease that they're trying to find a cure for, and it's a horrific disease. I don't remember the name of it, but it's horrific. And there's a cure that's known as Lorenzo's Oil. And being a doctor, he wanted to make sure this was legitimate. And that's what he did. He found out, researched it, and found out, oh gosh, this does exist. This is a true cure. So I think this is okay to make. And he did, so he wanted to get the word out. So from Lorenzo's Oil, Babe, he was producing, he wrote it, and it's this story of a pig. And he talks about how he saw this pig as the hero and even compares him to Max, his iconic Mad Max. And I never thought of it that way, and I thought that was brilliant. And Robert Rodriguez goes on to say that it would have been very easy, quote unquote easy, to make this an animation, to just basically cartoon it up. And George said, I didn't want to do that. So he waited, as he said, 10 years for the technology to exist for him to make Babe. And it's fantastic. Then he did make Babe, Pig in the City. He was able to follow up and direct the sequel, which is fantastic. Then he goes on and talks about how he was, I don't remember the cinematographer, but he had worked with Peter Jackson. He had worked on George Miller's projects, but then he worked with Peter Jackson on Lord of the Rings. And he showed him some early work of Andy Serkis working as Gollum. And George was floored, because now the technology existed to work on another project he had in mind called Happy Feet. And it's just fantastic to see how George had these ideas, much like, my hero, George Lucas, had these ideas, but the technology didn't exist, so he had to wait. But once the technology existed, bam, he created these great films. Not to mention the fact that this dude that created Mad Max and one of the best segments for the Twilight Zone movie was creating family films now. That is quite a change, and it's very impressive. So flash forward, the one thing they didn't talk about, which I'm a little bummed at, and I'm sure they had to gloss it over, they didn't talk about the non-happening Justice League movie that George Miller was supposed to direct in the early 2000s. I wish they had touched upon that because I want to know more and why it didn't happen, but they didn't. They kind of skipped over that whole area and went right to Fury Road. And in my opinion, George Miller took everything he learned from everything he's ever done and made a masterpiece in Fury Road. You can argue with me that the story's weak, what have you, okay. But if you look at it from a visual standpoint and an audio standpoint, that movie is pure genius and brilliant. There's nothing else you can say. It's brilliant. He talks about this several times, that he essentially wanted to make silent films that he could then put audio to, so it would be entertaining as a silent film. And if you watch that movie specifically, mission accomplished. He touched a little bit about his good friend Byron Kennedy and his passing and how much that affected him and meant to him, and you can see it. I mean, he hopped off of Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome, even though he had agreed to make that with Byron, because that was the movie Byron was scouting locations and was in a helicopter accident and passed away. And George was really affected and stepped away. The studio begged him to come back to basically make it more George Miller-esque, and he did. He did. That's basically the end chase scene with the train. And they basically just finished up with more retrospective and insight. And again, just Robert Rodriguez trying to stress to George Miller, dude, you are amazing, one of a kind. They don't make them like you. And again, George Miller just being very humble, and I don't believe this is a facade at all. Just being truly humble and being like, I did that. Yeah. It's very impressive to see. I highly recommend you check this out on the El Rey Network, or try and find it online on the El Rey Network. I honestly, I don't have that availability here with the El Rey Network. My in-laws do, so I check out all the El Rey Network stuff there. They have a great lineup of series. From Dusk Till Dawn is still one of my favorite movies with Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino. Just a fantastic film. But the TV series is fantastic as well. Check that out. Really, really hope you check out this director series. George Miller is a fascinating man, and I really enjoy Robert Rodriguez as a director, and a very accomplished director himself, interviewing people that I think he idolizes. So check it out, El Rey Network. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below.